September 1st, 1939, an ordinary day, yet one that would shatter the fragile peace of Europe. At dawn, German troops, with the precision of a well-oiled machine, swept across the border into Poland. The world watched in stunned silence as the Blitzkrieg strategy, lightning fast and ruthless, suddenly turned the tide of history. With their tanks, aircraft, and mobile infantry, the Germans seemed unstoppable, overwhelming the Polish defenses within days. But this was merely the beginning. Many believed it was the harbinger of a new era, one where the might of Nazi Germany would sweep through the continent, unfazed. In the months that followed, the Nazis' rapid advance through France, the Balkans, and beyond confirmed their overwhelming military superiority. Each victory reinforced a dangerous illusion. Berlin's high command believed they had mastered the art of war, swift, decisive, and ruthless. The myth of German invincibility grew, fed by headlines, medals, and the sheer speed at which their forces captured one city after another. For the soldiers, the war felt like a quick, brutal game of strategy, one they would surely win. The strategy was simple: attack, conquer, and move on. But there was a flaw, a deep, fundamental misunderstanding. Germany, believing its military genius would carry it through, failed to consider the impossible nature of a two-front war. A nation stretched thin, fighting from the sands of North Africa to the frozen steppes of Russia, across the skies of Britain and the streets of Paris, could not hope to sustain such an offensive. But at the time, it seemed unthinkable that the mighty Wehrmacht, equipped with the latest technologies, the finest commanders, and an unrelenting will, could ever falter. The world had underestimated Hitler's vision. Surely, this was a force capable of conquering all. Then came the cold, harsh winter of 1941. As the German forces found themselves entrenched outside Moscow, their supply lines strained, and morale waning, the cracks in their invincible armor began to show. What had once been a lightning assault had now become a slow, grinding battle of attrition. The myth of German superiority was beginning to crumble. But the full weight of their overconfidence would not be apparent until the tides of war began to turn. The question now loomed large: could they recover, or had their very arrogance sealed their fate? In the east, another front was about to awaken, and the Germans would soon face a new kind of enemy, one they had not prepared for. In the early years of the war, Germany's military successes seemed to justify its belief in the supremacy of technology and tactical brilliance. The Blitzkrieg, executed with remarkable speed and precision, crushed all in its path. Yet beneath the surface of these victories lay a crucial flaw, one that would slowly unravel the entire Nazi war effort. While the German military boasted the finest weapons and well-coordinated strategies, they had not fully accounted for the logistical nightmare that any prolonged war would present. Their ability to wage war depended not only on the speed of their strikes, but on the continuous flow of resources to sustain them. But that flow, it turned out, was far from secure. The early stages of the war were dominated by the rapid advances of German forces, from the conquest of Poland to the fall of France. Yet as the German forces moved deeper into enemy territory, they began to encounter an unexpected challenge. Their lines of supply could not keep pace. The very machines of war that had carried them to victory began to falter as fuel and raw materials became increasingly scarce. Despite Germany's industrial prowess, its supply chains remained vulnerable and precariously stretched. A powerful military that could launch a swift assault struggled to maintain the momentum once the fighting dragged on. The situation worsened as the war expanded to the Russian and North African fronts. The vastness of the Russian landscape presented one of the most formidable logistical challenges of the war. As German forces advanced into the Soviet Union, their supply lines grew longer and more difficult to protect. The once efficient delivery of fuel, ammunition, and food became a chaotic scramble, often arriving too late or in insufficient quantities. Similarly, in the harsh deserts of North Africa, the Germans found their access to essential resources blocked, their supply routes intercepted by the Allies, and their tanks idling due to fuel shortages. It was a cruel irony. A nation renowned for its industrial might, its precision engineering, and its military genius had failed to plan for the one thing that could stifle it, sustaining a war machine over vast distances. As the war stretched into 1942, the realization grew undeniable. Without the resources to fuel their relentless advance, Germany's strategy began to unravel. The forward momentum they once enjoyed now faltered, and the cracks in their careful, lie-constructed empire became impossible to ignore. But what they didn't know was that, in the coming months, the struggle for resources would lead them to a deadly crossroads, one that would prove that even the most powerful army cannot succeed without the infrastructure to sustain it. In the east, the harsh Russian winter was about to show the full consequences of their overreach. As 1941 unfolded, Germany's early successes seemed to reaffirm the belief in their invincibility. But beneath the surface of triumph, strategic miscalculations began to stack up. Hitler and his high command, intoxicated by their early victories, failed to recognize the mounting risks of their own decisions. The overconfidence that had propelled Germany to the heights of power now steered them toward an abyss. The initial successes in Poland, France, and the Balkans had masked the deeper flaws in their strategy, flaws that would soon prove fatal. In June of 1941, Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, a move that many saw as his most critical error. The decision to fight on the vast Eastern Front was not only an immense gamble, but one that failed to account for the brutal reality of Russia's size and climate. The Germans, fueled by their early triumphs, believed they could replicate their blitzkrieg success, crushing the Soviets within a few months. But they had underestimated the fierce resilience of the Red Army, the vastness of the Russian steppe, and most catastrophically, the arrival of winter. As German forces pushed deeper into Soviet territory, supply lines faltered and morale plummeted. The Russian winter descended swiftly and brutally, freezing the German army in place. Tanks and machinery froze while men, exhausted, hungry, and unprepared for the cold, suffered staggering casualties. The Germans were no longer the hunters, they had become the hunted. Yet this was only one front of many. The declaration of war on the United States in December 1941 added yet another strain to Germany's already overstretched military resources. The Germans, confident that Britain was on the verge of surrender, now faced the wrath of a newly empowered American military. It was a fatal miscalculation, one that would, over time, tip the scales of war irreversibly in favor of the Allies. As the war dragged on, Germany's hubris became increasingly apparent. They had opened multiple fronts, stretched their military too thin, and ignored the harsh realities of warfare. The failure of Operation Barbarossa in the winter of 1941 and the subsequent German defeat at the Battle of Stalingrad in 1942 marked a turning point. These were not just losses on the battlefield. They were the unraveling of a greater strategic vision. But as the Allies gained ground, the question remained. Could the Germans still regroup, or had their fatal overreach sealed their fate forever? In the coming months, the Allies would make their next bold move, and Germany's strategic errors would prove to be a permanent liability. By 1941, Adolf Hitler had become more than a dictator. He had transformed into a force of nature. His belief in his own destiny, in his ability to shape the course of history, was unshakable. He truly thought that his willpower could transcend the limitations of reality, that his visions for Germany's future could overcome the harsh obstacles of war. But as the war dragged on, Hitler's increasingly erratic decisions began to prove just how fragile that conviction was. What began as brilliant strategy turned to chaos under the weight of his inflexibility. The irony of Hitler's leadership lay in his refusal to listen to the counsel of his most experienced military commanders. Time and time again, he dismissed their advice, driven by an obsession with ideological purity rather than pragmatic strategy. His vision for the future of Germany was not shaped by the realities of war, but by an unwavering belief in his own righteousness. Even as his generals pleaded for more realistic objectives, concentrating forces, securing resources, or preparing for a winter offensive, Hitler insisted on pursuing an ever-expanding agenda. His vision for a greater Germany, rooted in racial and territorial expansion, had no room for compromise. The result was a string of disastrous decisions. The ill-fated invasion of the Soviet Union, Operation Barbarossa, which overstretched his forces, and the fateful declaration of war against the United States. In the harsh winter of 1941, as German troops lay frozen on the Russian steppe, it became painfully clear. The invincibility that Hitler believed in was nothing but a mirage. The vast Soviet terrain had swallowed up the German advance, and logistical nightmares turned into insurmountable obstacles. Hitler, however, refused to yield. He maintained that victory was still within reach, convinced that Soviet resolve would crumble. But his refusal to acknowledge reality led only to more suffering and more losses. With every step deeper into Russian territory, the Wehrmacht became more exposed and stretched thin. Supplies dwindled, reinforcements never arrived, and morale plummeted. Yet Hitler's obsession with his ideological crusade to break the Soviet Union and seize the oil-rich Caucasus kept him on course. By 1942, the war was no longer a series of well-coordinated campaigns. It had spiraled out of control. And still, Hitler's decisions grew more erratic. He insisted on micromanaging military operations, bypassing the advice of seasoned generals, making increasingly catastrophic choices. The Battle of Stalingrad, the turning point of the Eastern Front, was a reflection of this self-destructive leadership. His insistence on fighting to the last man, even as defeat loomed large, cost Germany not only the battle but the war's momentum. His generals were sidelined, their expertise ignored, as the Führers will crushed any hope for tactical flexibility. Hitler's arrogance had blinded him to the fundamental truth. No matter how powerful the leader, the tide of war could not be controlled by sheer force of will. His belief in his own genius, his desire to control every aspect of the war, ultimately ensured Germany's downfall. As the Allies grew stronger and Hitler's war machine faltered, it became clear that the leader who thought he could bend history had instead driven his nation into irreversible defeat. What would have happened if he had trusted his generals? If he had allowed for strategic flexibility? The questions, like the echoes of war, remain unanswered. In a bunker beneath Berlin, another decision would soon be made, a decision that would seal the fate of Germany once and for all. In the summer of 1942, German forces stood poised on the brink of what they believed would be the final blow to the Soviet Union. Hitler's gaze was fixed on Stalingrad, a strategic city that promised to be the gateway to the oil-rich Caucasus. The Germans were confident, too confident. Their earlier successes, their blitzkrieg triumphs, had given them a dangerous belief in their own invincibility. They believed the Soviet Union would crumble under the weight of their advancing war machine. But what they failed to consider was the unyielding spirit of the Soviet people, who would not bend or break, no matter the cost. As the German army approached Stalingrad in August, they expected a swift victory. The city's name, already a symbol of Stalin's defiance, was a challenge they could not ignore. But the reality they encountered was far harsher than anything their strategists had anticipated. The brutal Russian winter, which had already claimed thousands of German soldiers during the earlier stages of the invasion, descended early, and the conditions in Stalingrad became unbearable. The Germans were ill-prepared, their supply lines stretched thin, and their troops faced not just the relentless cold but fierce Soviet resistance. As the battle dragged on, the Germans found themselves bogged down, mired in urban combat that drained their strength and their resources. The struggle inside the city became a battle for survival. House by house, street by street, the German forces fought to capture a city that seemed determined to remain free. But with each passing day, the tide began to shift. The Germans, who had once marched forward with overwhelming confidence, now found themselves surrounded. The Soviets, with their boundless resilience and a seemingly inexhaustible supply of men, slowly tightened their grip, encircling the German Sixth Army. What had begun as a seemingly simple offensive soon became an unsolvable puzzle. German soldiers, trapped in the rubble of Stalingrad, faced starvation, disease, and the bitter reality that victory was slipping from their grasp. The irony was staggering. What was meant to be a decisive victory, a final crushing blow to Soviet resistance, had turned into a devastating defeat. Hitler's obsession with Stalingrad had led to a strategic blunder that now threatened to undo everything Germany had achieved. The Sixth Army, once the pride of the Wehrmacht, was crumbling. No reinforcements came, no relief. The Soviets, emboldened by their tenacity and their superior numbers, pressed on. By the winter of 1942, the German forces were fighting not for victory, but for survival. The turning point came in February of 1943, when the encircled German Sixth Army finally surrendered. The city that had seemed so essential to the Nazis was now a symbol of their hubris. What had appeared to be an unstoppable war machine was now in full retreat. The loss at Stalingrad was not merely a military defeat. It was the moment when the tide turned against Germany. The Eastern Front, once so promising, had become a graveyard of ambition. In the months that followed, the Soviet counteroffensive would push the Germans back, step by painful step. But the question remained, how much further could the Germans retreat before their entire war effort collapsed under the weight of their own failures? As the German forces began to retreat, they would soon face a new challenge, the Allies' growing presence in the West, and the inevitability of a two-front war. The retreat from Stalingrad was only the beginning. In the summer of 1942, Germany stood at the zenith of its military power, having conquered vast swaths of Europe. Hitler believed that victory was within reach, confident that the defeat of Britain and the Soviet Union would bring the spoils of war, the resources and territory that would secure Germany's dominance for generations. The war was already global in scope, yet Germany's leaders failed to fully appreciate the far-reaching consequences of their actions. What they couldn't foresee was the coming convergence of global forces, a united front that would challenge their very existence. The entry of the United States and Britain into the conflict shattered the illusion of German invincibility. At first, Hitler's regime saw the Americans and British as distant threats, slow to mobilize, seemingly reluctant to fully commit. But the reality proved far more sobering. The United States, with its industrial might, quickly transformed into an arsenal of democracy, producing war materials at an unprecedented scale. Meanwhile, Britain, despite the horrors of the Blitz, found a new strength in its alliance with the Americans. The combined industrial power of these two nations, alongside the Soviet Union, began to tip the scales in favor of the Allies. The Germans, who had relied on speed and technology to win battles, now faced an enemy that could outproduce them at every turn. They were not only fighting a war of attrition, they were fighting a war of resources, manpower, and unity. The struggle was immediate and brutal. Germany's war machine, stretched across multiple fronts, began to show signs of strain. On the distant Pacific island of Midway, a pivotal battle unfolded. The United States, in a masterstroke of intelligence and strategy, destroyed much of Japan's carrier fleet, significantly weakening the Axis power's naval strength. In North Africa, the Allies struck with Operation Torch in 1942, landing in French-held territories and pushing back German forces under the command of Erwin Rommel. For the first time, Germany was forced to retreat, and it became clear that they were no longer the sole force in the war. The irony, of course, was that Hitler had vastly underestimated the industrial power of America, a nation that had never known defeat and whose capacity for innovation and production was unmatched. Even more crucial was the realization that the Allies were not divided. They were united. The collaboration between the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union became the backbone of a coordinated, multi-front effort that Germany could not hope to replicate. While German scientists and engineers developed advanced technologies, rockets, jets, tanks, these innovations could not make up for the overwhelming combined strength of the Allies' industries. What began as a race for technological supremacy became a race for production, and the Allies held the advantage. The turning points were many: Midway, the landings in North Africa, and the mounting Soviet successes in the East. Germany's strategic position had begun to erode, and their enemies were not only surviving, they were thriving. The realization that the war could not be won by force alone began to settle over the German high command. What had once seemed a winnable war was now an uphill battle, one that would be lost not through technological failure, but through the sheer weight of global opposition. But what they didn't know was that the greatest challenge for the Germans lay ahead. As the Allies continued to grow stronger, a new force would soon rise on the horizon, and Germany's ability to hold on to its crumbling empire was quickly fading. In the quiet of a strategic meeting, the plans for a new assault were being drawn, one that would change the course of history forever. By 1943, Germany's position in the war had changed drastically. What had once seemed like a swift campaign for supremacy had become an endless, grueling battle of attrition. As the Allies' industrial output ramped up, Germany found itself increasingly unable to match the sheer volume of resources being funneled into the Allied war effort. The factories of the United States and Britain hummed with an unrelenting pace, turning out tanks, planes, and ammunition at rates the Germans simply could not sustain. The reality of a war of attrition, fought not on the battlefield alone but in factories and supply chains, began to settle in. In response, Germany looked to technological innovation as its last hope. The V-2 rocket, a terrifyingly advanced weapon, and the jet-powered aircraft, such as the Messerschmitt Me-262, represented the cutting edge of German engineering. These weapons, faster and more lethal than anything the Allies had, were seen as potential game-changers. But the irony of Germany's technological push was that while their scientists made extraordinary strides, their country's resources were dwindling. The factories, once bustling with the efficiency of total war production, were increasingly starved for raw materials. Fuel, metals, and manpower were in short supply. And despite the brilliance of their engineers, the Germans simply could not match the Allied industrial might. This tension between technological innovation and limited resources created a brutal paradox. The V-2 rockets, launched against Allied cities in the closing years of the war, were undeniably impressive. Yet their effectiveness was limited. Far too few were produced to make any significant difference in the outcome of the war. The jet aircraft, too, arrived too late and in insufficient numbers. Even with these innovations, Germany was fighting a losing battle. The technological edge, which had once been their greatest asset, now became a fleeting advantage in a war where numbers and resources were the deciding factors. Meanwhile, the pressure from multiple fronts was relentless. On the Eastern Front, the Soviet Union, having weathered the worst of the German onslaught, began pushing back with overwhelming force. The Germans were slowly but surely being driven out of the Soviet Union, their forces retreating as the Red Army encircled them and recaptured vast swaths of land. In the West, the Allies' strategic bombing campaign intensified. German cities, once the heart of the war effort, were reduced to rubble by waves of American and British bombers. The Luftwaffe, stretched thin and outmatched by the growing Allied air forces, could do little to halt the destruction. The skies over Germany became increasingly hostile, and each raid brought the realization that the Germans were losing control not just of their territory, but of their ability to wage war. The turning point in the air war came in 1943, as the Allies began to bomb German cities with such intensity that the Luftwaffe was unable to defend them effectively. The destruction of vital infrastructure, factories, transportation hubs, and military installations crippled Germany's ability to produce the weapons and supplies necessary to sustain their war effort. The Luftwaffe, which had once ruled the skies, was now caught in a desperate fight for survival. What had once been the pride of Germany's military might now found itself overwhelmed by the industrial power of its enemies. In this contest of attrition, it became clear that Germany's technological innovations, no matter how advanced, could not overcome the fundamental disadvantage they faced. They simply could not outproduce the Allies. The Allies, with their seemingly endless resources and manpower, had the upper hand. The war had become less about breakthroughs in technology and more about a relentless grinding of military forces, where the side with the greatest ability to replace losses, produce more, and outlast the other would ultimately prevail. But as the war pressed on, the Allies' superior production capabilities began to outweigh Germany's technological prowess. The scale of this disadvantage became impossible to ignore. With each passing month, Germany's ability to keep pace dwindled. Even as the German military tried to regroup, their ability to recover from the crushing blows dealt by the Allies diminished. The war of attrition that had once seemed winnable now appeared increasingly like a slow-motion collapse. As the Allies closed in from all directions, one question remained. How much longer could the Third Reich endure, and could Germany's last desperate attempts at technological superiority turn the tide before it was too late? In the midst of this mounting pressure, a new and decisive battle would soon unfold, a battle that would determine the fate of the war and the world. June 6, 1944. The world held its breath as the first waves of Allied troops landed on the beaches of Normandy. The Germans, despite years of preparation and fortification, were caught off guard. The Allies' amphibious assault, an unprecedented feat of coordination, came not with the rumble of a single front but with a roar from multiple directions, as thousands of ships, planes, and soldiers converged upon the beaches. The Germans had long fortified the coastline, convinced that the Allies would never dare to cross the English Channel. But they were wrong. The irony was stark. Hitler had refused to believe that such a massive invasion was possible, dismissing reports and even the advice of his generals. He had convinced himself that the Allies would strike at Pas-de-Calais, but the Allies had cleverly diverted their efforts to Normandy. The resulting surprise was devastating. As German forces scrambled to respond, the Allies quickly secured a foothold on the continent. The beaches were soaked with the blood of young men, but the ground they held was the first step in a campaign that would soon push deep into the heart of Nazi-occupied Europe. D-Day marked the beginning of the end for Germany. What followed was a rapid series of Allied advances across Western Europe. The liberation of France was only the first chapter of a much larger story. The Germans, once so confident, now found themselves fighting on multiple fronts. In the east, the Soviet Union had already begun to reclaim territory, their relentless march westward continuing with unstoppable momentum. In the west, the Allies pushed through France, Belgium, and into Germany itself. Germany, exhausted and stretched thin, could no longer sustain the defense that had once seemed impenetrable. The revelation was clear. The collapse of Nazi Germany was inevitable. The once imposing war machine, which had swept across Europe with such speed and ruthlessness, was now a shell of its former self. Despite Hitler's refusal to accept reality, the Allies' combined force of men, materials, and strategy was simply too much. Germany was caught in a vice, squeezed between the relentless pressure of the Red Army in the east and the unstoppable Allied advance from the west. What followed was a bitter, drawn-out final fight. Cities once known for their grandeur, Berlin, Munich, Hamburg, became the scenes of devastation. The Luftwaffe, already broken by years of Allied bombing, could do little to stem the tide. The German military, now broken and demoralized, fought on under the command of officers who knew the war was lost but had no choice but to follow orders. Yet even as the end drew near, Hitler refused to entertain the idea of surrender. His insistence on fighting to the bitter end ensured further destruction. The battlefields were littered with the bodies of soldiers who, under different leadership, might have lived to see a different future. The final irony, perhaps, was that Hitler's refusal to negotiate or retreat, his obsession with a total victory that no longer existed, cost Germany dearly. The war could have ended sooner with fewer lives lost, but Hitler's delusion that he could still win pushed the war to its final, tragic conclusion. In the streets of Berlin, as the Allies closed in, the question remained: how much further could Germany fall before it was utterly erased from the pages of history? But what they didn't know was that in the heart of Europe, another chapter was unfolding, one that would see the world forever change. As the Soviet flag rose over Berlin, the reality of a new world order began to take shape. In the ashes of a broken nation, the Cold War was about to begin, and the balance of power would never be the same again. By 1945, the world had already seen the cost of Nazi ambition. Cities shattered, millions dead, entire nations torn apart. But the end was now in sight. As Allied forces closed in on Germany from both east and west, the once-proud Reich that had seemed invincible in its rise was now unraveling. In Berlin, Hitler's empire teetered on the brink of collapse, the consequences of years of hubris finally coming to fruition. What had once been a well-oiled machine of conquest was now a broken shell, its leaders scrambling for survival, while the Allies drew ever closer. Germany's leadership, fractured and disorganized, had no clear plan for defense or retreat. Hitler, isolated in his underground bunker, continued to issue orders that made little sense, while his generals and ministers fought amongst themselves. What had once been a carefully controlled dictatorship was now a chaotic scramble for control. The long-expected collapse had arrived not as a single devastating blow, but as a slow, agonizing deterioration. There was no unified strategy, only a sense of desperate urgency and confusion. Each command seemed to be contradicted by the next. The Nazi leadership, long intoxicated by their own sense of superiority, was now scrambling for a solution that did not exist. The irony was bitter. Hitler, who had promised the German people victory and a 1,000-year Reich, now faced the consequences of his earlier promises. The war, once believed to be a mission of unyielding purpose, had devolved into a series of catastrophic mistakes. His refusal to acknowledge reality, the endless overreach, the strategic blunders, and the inability to learn from mistakes had led the Reich to this moment. The man who had once believed himself to be a visionary leader now stood powerless in the face of an unstoppable tide. The German people, who had once followed him with fervor, were left with nothing but destruction in their wake. On the Eastern Front, the Soviet army had pushed forward relentlessly, capturing city after city, grinding down the German defenses with unimaginable force. As Soviet forces closed in on Berlin, the battle for the city became a brutal and inevitable affair. Street by street, house by house, the Germans fought with the last of their strength, but it was clear that the end was near. As Soviet tanks rolled through the heart of Berlin, the question was no longer if Germany would surrender, but when. The Soviet flag rose over the Reichstag on May 2, 1945, and with it came the end of Nazi rule. Berlin had fallen. Germany's surrender was imminent. The ultimate reason for Germany's defeat was clear. It was not a lack of will or even intelligence. It was the result of overextension, of attempting to conquer too much, too quickly. The failure to adjust to a war fought on multiple fronts, the failure to secure vital resources, and the underestimation of their enemies, industrial and military capabilities had finally caught up with the Nazis. Germany's ability to outfight and outproduce the Allies had long since been surpassed, and the technological advantages they had once hoped would win the war now proved insufficient to counter the overwhelming force of the Allied advance. The moral irony, however, is that Germany's downfall was not solely due to a lack of resolve or the inadequacy of their military. It was the combination of miscalculations, the refusal to adapt, the overconfidence, the disregard for the realities of modern warfare, that led to their ultimate defeat. Hitler's leadership, once hailed as revolutionary, had transformed into a fatal flaw, resulting in a disastrous series of decisions that sealed the fate of the Third Reich. As the war in Europe drew to a close, the consequences of Germany's actions were clear. The nation lay in ruins, its cities decimated, its people shattered. But the true reasons for their defeat were rarely discussed in simple terms. The complexity of the war, its technological, industrial, and moral dimensions, remained a story told in fragments. As the Allies celebrated victory, Germany's leaders paid the price for their miscalculations, but the nation's future remained uncertain. The collapse of the Nazi regime would forever mark the end of an era. Yet, in the ashes of a defeated Reich, a new world order was being forged, one that would rise from the devastation and reshape the global balance of power. What would become of the millions left in the wake of the war? The answers to those questions would unfold in the decades to come, but one thing was certain. The legacy of the Third Reich would forever be shaped by the events of the final days. And in the silence that followed, the world began to reckon with the cost of a war that had changed everything. By the winter of 1944, the Allies had pushed deep into German-occupied Europe, their forces advancing through France, Belgium, and into Germany itself. The air was thick with the promise of an imminent victory, but even as the Allies closed in from all sides, the war's outcome was not yet a foregone conclusion. On the ground, the struggle was brutal. The German military, though increasingly weakened, was still capable of inflicting tremendous damage. The sound of artillery fire, the roar of tanks, and the crackle of gunfire punctuated the harsh winter months. It was clear to all involved. The Allies' success was no longer just a matter of tactical superiority, but a question of endurance. The irony of this phase of the war was undeniable. Despite the technological innovations that Germany had once believed would secure victory, advanced tanks, rocket weapons, and jet fighters, it was the Allies' ability to coordinate their forces, mass their resources, and sustain their war effort that proved decisive. The Germans, by contrast, had overextended themselves, fighting on multiple fronts with increasingly depleted resources. Their once mighty war machine, while still lethal, was now a shadow of its former self. The Allies, by contrast, had drawn on the full weight of their industrial power. The United States, in particular, had become the world's arsenal, churning out war materials at a pace that the Germans could not hope to match. In every battle, the Allies brought greater numbers, more supplies, and an unrelenting determination that wore down the enemy. The turning point came in the winter of 1944 with the Battle of the Bulge, Germany's last major offensive on the Western Front. In a desperate bid to disrupt the Allied advance, German forces launched a surprise attack in the Ardennes, hoping to split the American and British forces and seize critical supply lines. The Germans initially made significant gains, but their momentum was short-lived. The weather, which had initially favored the attackers, soon turned against them. The Allies quickly adapted, using their superior air power to destroy German supply lines and cut off the advancing forces. What had begun as a desperate push to regain lost ground became a catastrophic failure. German forces, exhausted and depleted, were unable to maintain their offensive, and the battle marked the end of organized German resistance in the West. As the Allies regrouped and advanced further into Germany, the internal weaknesses of the German war effort became increasingly apparent. The collapse of the German military was not just a matter of losing battles. It was a complete breakdown of their ability to sustain the war. Supplies were running low, morale was shattered, and the leadership of the Third Reich had become increasingly fragmented. Hitler's obsessive micromanagement and refusal to acknowledge the realities of the situation only hastened the collapse. The resources that had once fueled Germany's ambitions, oil, raw materials, manpower, had dwindled to nothing. The Allies, by contrast, had continued to press forward relentlessly, knowing that victory was within their grasp. It was a war of endurance, and the Allies had outlasted the Germans. Final blow came on May 7, 1945, when Germany unconditionally surrendered to the Allies, ending the war in Europe. The surrender was not the result of a single decisive battle, but the culmination of years of strategic pressure, logistical superiority, and the relentless application of force. The war had ended not just because the Germans had lost the will to fight, but because they had been overwhelmed by an enemy that could produce more, fight longer, and sustain greater losses. The victory was not a testament to tactical brilliance alone, but to the ability to coordinate and sustain a global effort in the face of overwhelming odds. The moral irony of Germany's defeat lies in the fact that their loss was not merely a failure of tactics or technology, but a profound failure of leadership. Hitler's refusal to adapt to changing circumstances, his obsession with unachievable goals, and his inability to manage the complexities of a world war led directly to the collapse of the Reich. The Germans had developed some of the most advanced weapons and military strategies in history, but these could not overcome the fundamental weaknesses that lay at the heart of their war effort: strategic overreach, internal disarray, and a failure to recognize the limits of their power. As the war in Europe came to a close, the world looked back at the incredible cost of the conflict and the remarkable resilience of the nations that had fought to end it. But the question remained: what would the future hold? The defeat of Nazi Germany marked the end of one chapter, but it also signaled the beginning of another. A new world order was being born, and the repercussions of this long, devastating war would shape the coming decades. But what the Allies didn't yet know was that the shadow of war was not over. A new struggle, one of ideology, would soon divide the world in ways no one could yet predict. By the spring of 1945, the final collapse of the Nazi regime was imminent. The once mighty empire, built on promises of a 1,000-year Reich, had been reduced to rubble. Berlin, once the symbol of Nazi power, now lay at the mercy of the Soviet forces. The city that had witnessed grand parades, speeches, and dreams of conquest was now encircled, a city on the brink of destruction. The Nazi leadership, once so resolute in their vision of global domination, was faced with the crushing reality of defeat. There was no escape, no victory to be claimed. Only ruin awaited them. At the heart of this collapse was Adolf Hitler's own vision, a vision that had blinded him to the practical necessities of war. For years, Hitler had obsessed over his ideological dream of conquering the East. The invasion of the Soviet Union had been his grandest gamble, one he believed would secure German dominance for generations. Yet, as the war unfolded, it became clear that Hitler's ideological obsession had left him blind to the realities of warfare. His failure to secure the resources, the manpower, and the logistical infrastructure necessary to sustain a war of such scale was his ultimate undoing. Instead of recognizing the importance of a unified effort, he pursued a reckless expansion, ignoring the growing pressure from the Allies on all fronts. The turning point came swiftly. With Soviet forces storming Berlin and the Western Allies advancing from the west, Nazi leadership began to crumble. High-ranking officials, isolated and surrounded, were forced to confront the failure of their grand plans. Hitler's refusal to face the realities of the war meant that his decisions had created a fractured, weakened command structure. There were no longer clear directives, no coordinated strategy, only confusion, desperation, and infighting. The military that had once moved with efficiency and precision now floundered, unable to mount a coherent defense. The collapse of the Nazi leadership, coupled with the rapid fragmentation of the German war effort, signaled the end of the war in Europe. The surrender of Berlin, followed by the unconditional surrender of Germany, would mark the final death knell of the Third Reich. A new Europe would soon be born, one shaped by the ashes of Nazi ambition. The war had been won, but not by the vision of Nazi Germany. It was the Allied commitment to unity to working together in ways that Germany had never understood that secured the victory. The industrial power of the United States, combined with the resilience and strategic coordination of the Allies, was a force that Germany could not withstand. Hitler had once believed that a single, unyielding will could shape the world. Yet it was the collaboration, the sharing of resources, the cooperation between nations, something he had dismissed as weakness, that became the foundation of the Allies' success. The irony, of course, lay in what Hitler had fundamentally misunderstood about modern warfare. He had assumed that sheer force, ideological purity, and a singular vision would carry Germany to victory. But the true power of modern conflict lay not in the strength of individual armies or the will of a single leader, but in logistics, in cooperation, and in the ability to adapt. The Allies, with their vast resources, their coordination, and their willingness to work together, outmatched Germany at every turn. What Hitler had considered a mere tactical advantage, the ability to control and dictate, was not enough to win a war fought on a global scale. Germany's defeat, then, was not the result of a lack of strength or technology. It was the direct result of Hitler's inability to understand the power of unity and the strength that lay in cooperation. The Allies, united by necessity and driven by the common goal of defeating a global threat, had proven that the most powerful weapon in warfare was not a tank, nor a fighter jet, nor a battlefield victory. It was the shared effort of many nations, working together toward a common end. As the war in Europe came to a close, the question that lingered in the air was not only about the fall of Nazi Germany, but about the world that would emerge from its ashes. The division of Germany, the rise of new powers, and the ideological struggles that would define the Cold War were all still to come. The full scope of the war's consequences had yet to be realized. In the weeks and months that followed the fall of Berlin, the world would begin to understand the true cost of the war and the true nature of victory. The consequences of Hitler's vision and the failure to see the power of unity would echo through history, shaping the course of the 20th century in ways no one could have predicted. In the aftermath of World War II, the true reasons behind Germany's defeat became clearer with each passing year. For a nation that had once prided itself on its speed and precision, it was now undeniable that Germany's greatest mistake had been its failure to recognize the nature of modern warfare. What had begun as a series of swift, decisive victories had turned into a brutal, unrelenting war of attrition. Germany, for all its brilliance on the battlefield, had never fully understood the scale of conflict it had entered. This was no longer a war of maneuver and quick conquests. It was a war of endurance, of resources, of logistics. And in this war, Germany would not prevail. The irony of Germany's situation was bitter. Despite the early successes of Blitzkrieg, where speed and surprise had rendered enemy forces in disarray, the Germans could never maintain that momentum. Each victory, while impressive, only served to stretch their resources thinner and thinner. The Allies, on the other hand, had the industrial power to replace losses, rebuild armies, and sustain their efforts indefinitely. In contrast to the German reliance on rapid conquests and limited engagements, the Allied strategy was one of overwhelming force, one they could sustain across the vast distances of Europe and beyond. Germany, by 1942, was already fighting a war on multiple fronts, against enemies whose industrial might and manpower were simply too much to overcome. What became clear in the final years of the war was the fundamental reason behind Germany's collapse. It was not simply a lack of tactical innovation, but a complete inability to sustain a war on multiple fronts. As the Soviet Union pressed from the east and the Allies invaded from the west, the German war machine was stretched to breaking point. Hitler's decision to invade the Soviet Union, while initially successful, had drained Germany of the resources it desperately needed to continue the fight on both fronts. With supply lines stretched across Europe and into Russia, the Germans could not effectively replenish their forces, maintain their equipment, or feed their soldiers. The early victories were rendered meaningless by the inability to hold what had been gained. By 1943, it was clear. Germany's ability to sustain a war of attrition was not just in question, it was no longer possible. The turning point came with the slow realization that the Allies, despite their earlier mistakes and delays, had learned from their own errors. By 1944, the industrial might of the United States had turned the tide. In parallel, the Soviet Union, having weathered the worst of the German assault, began to push back with incredible force. The Germans had built some of the most advanced weapons of the time, rockets, jet fighters, tanks. But these advances were rendered ineffective in the face of a relentless Allied production machine that could outnumber and outlast them. The Allies' ability to adapt, coordinate, and above all, produce at an unprecedented scale overwhelmed the Germans' fragmented strategy. Germany, for all its technological advancements, simply could not keep up with the pace and scale of the war. Their efforts to innovate in technology were overshadowed by the Allies' ability to outproduce and sustain combat. In moral reflection, it becomes evident that the war was not lost due to lack of courage or military brilliance. German soldiers, like their counterparts on the Allied side, showed incredible resilience and bravery. Yet the war was ultimately determined not by the bravery of individual soldiers, but by the scale of strategic missteps that shaped the entire conflict. Germany's leadership, particularly Hitler, failed to adapt to the realities of modern warfare. By overextending their military, underestimating their enemy's industrial capabilities, and relying too heavily on technological superiority, they failed to recognize the fundamental truth. Wars are won not only on the battlefield, but in factories, in supply lines, and in the ability to endure. Germany's failure was inevitable. The moment they ignored the strategic necessity of maintaining a sustainable war effort on multiple fronts, the writing was on the wall. The inability to adapt their tactics to the realities of global warfare, the realization that war was no longer won through speed alone, but through sustained effort and cooperation, sealed their fate. It wasn't that the Germans lacked the capability to fight, but rather that they could not sustain it. The Allied forces, bolstered by their immense industrial capacity and unified efforts, would simply outlast them. As the war drew to a close, the rubble of the German war effort lay scattered across Europe. But as the war ended, another question lingered. How would the lessons of this catastrophic conflict shape the world to come? The rise of new superpowers, the redefinition of global alliances, and the looming shadows of nuclear weapons all emerged from the ashes of a war fought and lost for reasons that seemed, in hindsight, so tragically flawed. In the quiet that followed the end of the war, the world began to rebuild. But the scars of Germany's failure would remain a warning to all. The true nature of victory in the modern age had been revealed, and it was not found in the strength of armies alone, but in the power to endure and adapt. The year was 1945, and the world stood on the precipice of change. The once dominant Nazi regime lay in ruins, its final breath taken in the aftermath of an inevitable defeat. In the weeks and months following the fall of Berlin, the true reasons behind Germany's collapse began to emerge, not just from the battlefield, but from a deeper understanding of the nature of the war itself. The ultimate reason for Germany's defeat was not a singular battle lost, nor was it simply the failure of technology to tip the scales. No, it was the result of Germany's inability to win the war on multiple fronts, compounded by Hitler's repeated strategic errors and the dangerous overconfidence that clouded his judgment. Despite their remarkable technological advancements, the German forces found themselves incapable of matching the industrial might and coordinated military strength of the Allies. It was a bitter irony. Germany had produced some of the most advanced weapons and military strategies of the era: jet aircraft, the V-2 rocket, advanced tanks. But these innovations could not compensate for the basic inability to sustain war on the scale that the Allies could. The war that Hitler had started with such bold ambition had, by 1944, become one that was fought not with technological marvels alone, but with endless waves of men, materials, and relentless pressure. The Allies, with their industrial power and capacity for cooperation, outlasted the Germans in every crucial way. The turning point came when Germany, despite its earlier successes, could no longer sustain its military onslaught. The Allies, who had been underestimating the Germans for years, now fully understood the nature of the war. The industrial output of the United States, combined with the raw manpower and strategic coordination of the Soviet Union and Britain, formed a nearly unstoppable force. The Germans, meanwhile, found themselves struggling to replace losses, maintain their supply lines, and protect vital resources. It was a war of attrition, one that Germany simply could not win. Each military advance, each technological leap forward was rendered irrelevant by the Allies' ability to outproduce and outlast them. As the Allies closed in from both east and west, the inevitable surrender became clear. Hitler's refusal to acknowledge his strategic failures was, perhaps, the most fatal flaw of all. His hubris, the belief that his will could shape history, that his vision could bend the world to his ideals, blinded him to the realities of war. Even as the strategic situation became increasingly dire, Hitler remained obsessed with his ideological goals, refusing to listen to the advice of his generals or adjust to the shifting tides of the conflict. This stubbornness led directly to Germany's downfall. By the time Berlin was surrounded, Hitler's grip on the war was more psychological than strategic. His refusal to retreat, his insistence on continuing the fight despite the hopelessness of the situation, ensured that Germany would face an end of their own making. The war ended with Germany's unconditional surrender, signaling the collapse of its imperial ambitions. What had begun as a campaign of conquest and domination ended with the unconditional capitulation of the Nazi regime. The Third Reich was no more, and the realization of just how far their ambitions had overreached was stark. The aftermath of the war brought with it not only the end of Nazi rule, but the unraveling of the myth of German invincibility. Germany's once unstoppable war machine had been overwhelmed, not by enemy firepower alone, but by the simple force of logistics, coordination, and sheer industrial capacity. The true revelation, though, was that Germany's greatest error was underestimating the logistical strength of the Allied forces. It wasn't just the weapons they had that made them strong. It was their ability to sustain the war, to keep fighting even when it seemed like all was lost. The Allies had the resources to continue the fight indefinitely, to replace losses, and to outlast the Germans in every essential way. While Germany, with all its technological prowess, could not replenish its strength fast enough to keep up. The lesson was clear. Modern warfare is not won by technological superiority alone, but by logistics, unity, and adaptability. As the war drew to a close, Germany's defeat became an undeniable fact, not the result of a lack of effort or bravery, but the consequence of strategic miscalculations, hubris, and a failure to adapt to the modern realities of global warfare. The lesson of the war was one that would resonate through history. Victory in war is not just about force. It's about the ability to endure, to adapt, and to outlast your enemy. But what Germany didn't realize, and what the Allies soon discovered, was that the real challenges of this new world had just begun. The shape of the future was still being written, and the price of victory would come with consequences that no one could have predicted. In the coming years, the very lessons of the war would form the foundations of a new global order, one that would pivot on the balance of power, and the lessons learned from a conflict that had torn the world apart. Germany's defeat in 1945 did more than mark the end of the Third Reich. It reshaped the entire world order, setting in motion the geopolitical changes that would define the second half of the 20th century. As Berlin fell, so did the illusions of a German-dominated Europe. In the wake of war, the foundations of a new global structure began to take shape. The defeat of Nazi Germany heralded not just the collapse of a brutal regime, but the end of an era where unchecked military expansion could redraw the map of the world. Instead, it opened the door for a new, far more complex international reality. The revelation became clear in the immediate aftermath. Germany's defeat was not just the end of a war, but the beginning of a new geopolitical landscape. The once mighty empire, which had sought to impose its vision of global order through military dominance, was now relegated to a divided and broken state. Europe itself was shattered, its political, economic, and social fabric torn apart by the ravages of war. But what Germany failed to recognize during its expansionist push, the importance of unity and adaptability, became the cornerstone of the post-war world order. The Allies, despite their differences, had united in a common cause and achieved a level of cooperation that outlasted the war itself. This unity, combined with the unprecedented industrial capacity of the United States, gave birth to a new international system built on cooperation rather than conquest. As the dust settled across Europe, Germany's role on the world stage was forever altered. The once mighty Reich, which had sought to dominate through military force, was now divided between East and West. The Allies, particularly the United States and the Soviet Union, had imposed their will on the continent, each side shaping its sphere of influence. The Marshall Plan, aimed at rebuilding war-torn Europe, stood in stark contrast to the Nazi vision of a ravaged continent under the boot of a single power. This division F Europe, where Western nations embraced democratic ideals while Eastern nations fell under Soviet control, marked the beginning of the Cold War, an ideological and military standoff that would last for decades. The war's outcome served as a stark reminder of the power of cooperation in the face of overwhelming adversity. The Allies had won not just because of their military might, but because they understood the importance of collaboration. Nations that had once been bitter rivals, Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union, found a common purpose. Their industrial might, strategic coordination, and collective resolve ultimately overpowering Germany's isolated efforts. In this new world, it was no longer enough to rely on force alone. The global order that emerged after 1945 was one that demanded cooperation, diplomacy, and the ability to adapt. But the war's legacy was not merely about the triumph of the Allies. It also served as a reminder of the dangers of overextending militarily and ignoring the limits of power. Germany had once believed that their military could overcome any obstacle, that their technological innovations and relentless ambition would ensure victory. Yet their inability to recognize the vastness of the resources required to sustain a war on multiple fronts, and their overconfidence in their military superiority, sealed their fate. The Allies, by contrast, had understood something Germany could not. War is not only fought with weapons, but with industrial and strategic might. The ability to outproduce, to maintain supply lines, to rally nations to a common cause, was just as crucial to victory as battlefield tactics. The real lesson of the war, however, lies in the understanding that no nation can conquer the world without recognizing the limits of its own power. In the end, it was not the size of Germany's armies, nor the brilliance of their weapons that brought them down. It was their failure to adapt, their inability to adjust to the scale of modern warfare, and their refusal to acknowledge the immense power of the Allies' unity and industrial strength. The war showed the world that unchecked ambition and overreach lead to ruin, while cooperation and adaptation lead to strength. Germany's defeat marked the end of one era, but the beginning of another. A new world was taking shape, one that would be defined by new powers, new alliances, and new struggles. And while the shadow of war would continue to loom over the world, the lessons learned from Germany's collapse would echo throughout the century, shaping the strategies and policies of nations for decades to come. But what they didn't know was that the legacy of World War II would not only change the future of Europe, it would redefine the very nature of warfare itself. In the years following, global powers would grapple with the balance of power, and the strategic missteps of the past would guide the decisions of the future. The world, forever altered by the war, would continue to evolve, but the price of this evolution had been steep, and the lessons learned would carry the weight of history. They believed they could conquer Europe. They never did. Those words, etched into the history of the Second World War, mark the bitter irony of Nazi Germany's rise and fall. What began as a campaign driven by ambition and arrogance ended in ruin. The war was not won through sheer force or technological brilliance, but through the strategic clarity, industrial power, and perseverance of the Allied forces. The truth behind Germany's defeat lies not in the failure of individual battles, but in the deeper, systemic flaws that ultimately led to their collapse. Germany's loss is a testament to the fact that war is won not by bravado or cutting-edge weaponry alone, but by the ability to endure. The Allies, despite their early missteps, mastered the art of logistics, sustaining their forces over immense distances, replacing lost equipment, and maintaining a steady flow of resources. The Germans, by contrast, found themselves stretched thin, their supply lines strained, their military stretched across multiple fronts, unable to recover from the relentless pressure brought to bear by the combined industrial might of the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union. In the end, it was not the individual brilliance of a commander or the flash of a new weapon that determined the outcome. It was the ability to outlast, to adapt, and to collaborate. The revelation from the war's conclusion was clear. The true lesson from WWII is that victory lies not in bravado or advanced technology, but in endurance, cooperation, and adaptability. In a world where technology evolves rapidly, where strategic calculations can change in a matter of hours, the real power lies in the ability to adjust to new realities. The German forces had innovative technology, impressive tactics, and a well-disciplined military, but they could not adapt fast enough to the scale of modern warfare. They overestimated their ability to sustain a war of conquest and failed to understand the deeper strategic necessity of collaboration and logistics. What began as an unstoppable force soon crumbled under the weight of its own overreach. The irony of Germany's downfall cannot be overstated. While the Nazi regime prided itself on its superiority, militarily, ideologically, and technologically, the very hubris that led them to believe they could reshape Europe in their image was their undoing. Hitler's refusal to heed warnings from his generals, his obsession with a vision of global dominance that ignored the realities of global conflict, and his relentless pursuit of conquest stretched Germany's resources beyond the breaking point. What appeared to be strategic brilliance at first became a crippling flaw as the war dragged on. Overconfidence, combined with an unwillingness to adapt, proved to be the most powerful forces in the conflict. The ultimate victory for the Allies lay in understanding the importance of logistics, not just in the heat of battle, but in the long game of global warfare. The Allies had built an intricate, interconnected system that allowed them to mobilize resources, share intelligence, and coordinate strategies across vast distances. Their industrial capacity was unmatched, and their ability to replenish losses and adjust to shifting tides of war made them an unstoppable force. Germany, meanwhile, failed to build the infrastructure necessary to sustain its expansion, focusing on short-term gains rather than long-term strategies. The contrast was stark. Germany built an empire but never the infrastructure to support it. Germany's defeat in World War II stands as a powerful reminder that military victories cannot be won on the battlefield alone. While strategic brilliance and technological innovations certainly played their part, it was the inability to sustain a war, to adapt to the evolving nature of conflict, and to cooperate on a global scale that determined the outcome. The war was not simply lost due to poor tactics, but because Germany's leadership failed to understand the full scope of what modern warfare demanded. They underestimated the power of logistics, cooperation, and ultimately their own limitations. In the end, the story of Nazi Germany's defeat is not just one of military failure, but of a deep misunderstanding of the nature of global conflict. They believed they could conquer Europe, but they never built the systems to sustain such a conquest. The lasting legacy of this failure is a reminder to all nations. The true strength of any military force lies not in the speed of its advance, but in its ability to endure and adapt over time. But what they didn't know was that in the years to come, new challenges would emerge, challenges that would test the very lessons learned from this devastating war. As the world rebuilt and redefined itself, the ultimate question remained. How would these lessons be applied in a world now divided by the shadow of Cold War tensions? In the coming years, the answers would begin to unfold, shaping the future of warfare, diplomacy, and international relations.